This is what it's going to look like down on the bottom. I drew my line here, and this is actually going to be the next tile right here is going to be butted up tight against this line, so the top of this tile will be right there. This is my grout joint. I'm always going to have this tile slid on the left side so it's touching the left side of the grid. And so once you figure that out, you need to remember that during the process of your cutting. And so what I mean is if I come over here, I know that this is going to be butted, a tile is going to be butted right here. So I'm going to have a grout joint here before I get to the next tile. So what I need to do is I need to measure from the wall to this line. I come up with 5 5/8. And so I want to subtract a grout joint and 1/8 of an inch along the wall here. So it's 3/8 of an inch. So if right here my tile is 5 5/8, that means it's going to be a 5 1/8 inch piece that I'm going to make to allow for that grout joint and the gap along the wall. And so now you know that the wall can kind of bow in and out in a few spots. So you want to just go and start measuring and make sure that you're cutting the tiles to the right size in each space where it's going to go. Now if you measure here, you're going to measure from the wall to the line and subtract 1/8 of an inch. And so I have 5 3/8, and I'll subtract that 1/8 of an inch, so it's going to be 5 1/4. And I'll do the same thing, I'll measure all the way up because we already have our grout line here. This is where the grout line is now, it's on this side. This is where the tile starts because we're always starting our tile on this left line of the grid. And so I'll go through and I'll measure all those and I'll start cutting. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm putting thin set on the wall in this bottom row. And I'm just spreading it evenly. I'm coming right up to that line so I can still see it. And then you can see that I'm covering these other lines, which is fine because we can still see them up there. As long as our main line right there is exposed so that we can make sure we're straight and level on that, we'll be okay. But I put thin set on here and now I'm just gonna come through and rake my trowel across and make sure I got some nice even tracks. Go along it a couple times. And then we'll just take our margin trowel here and I'll just scrape some of this off on the bottom. That's right on the edge there. And just get rid of that. It's okay if you make a little mess, you can sponge it out. I always make sure I have a bucket of water and a sponge with me when I'm doing tile. Okay, you can see up here I wrote my numbers so I remember where they're still at. So now I'll just start with number 1, make sure I put that cut side down. Now remember, there's going to be a grout joint right here. So number 2, which is right here, is gonna be right on that line then. So now I'm going to take some wedges here and I'm going to wedge these up on the bottom. And that's what I'm going to do to get it to be straight up there, and just put more wedge in if you need to. You can always use more, too. You can use 2 wedges. This is really the most critical part now. It was critical for you to get your tile or your line snapped. Now it's critical for you to get your tile up to that line, that first line there, because everything's going to go off of this bottom row. Set that on there. And again, we'll wedge that up a little bit. Until you get it straight on that line. Now we'll go with number 4. And that's got to line up with that line. So after I do that, now I can adjust this back. And all of this will clean off later. What's on the bottom there, you can go back in a little while and wipe it off. If they got too much down there though, you want to get rid of it. Just spread your grout lines out now. And to be absolutely sure that you're good, you can take your level then. And run your level across the top of it and make sure you're level. And then look underneath and make sure if you need to raise or lower anything. Sometimes it's hard to see that line. And then we'll come back around with the level in a minute. And so it's going nice and quick now. So there's our first row. And as all I did is in between the grid here, I made sure that my tiles hit this line, and then I just kind of spaced them out a little bit on this part of it and eyeballed it. I didn't stick a spacer in there. You can, but again, and I've noticed this with these tiles, I have different size tiles, so it's really difficult to use spacers and make them perfect when you're using spacers, because they're going to go off. That's why I like to use a grid. So we're at the mercy of the spacers going up, but the width, we kind of have a little play. But we can use wedge, and I'll show you in a minute how we're going to use that. So now that you got your base done, now we can come up and really start putting some thin set on this wall. And I can do halfway, and do a couple tiles. You can go all the way up, do one part of the grid, and then come and do the other. And I'll just split this in half, but you'll see how fast it goes. The key is that you don't want your thin set to sit on this wall too long. But anyway, just keep getting this thin set on the wall here. You can see I'm covering my lines, which is okay. And if it gets to be messy for you, just go back and wipe it off. It'll all wipe off. But I just put a little bit on at a time. I'm not mixing it too dry, but it's not so wet either that it's dripping off the wall. It's really a smooth thin set right now. But you get up to your line. Nice and tight. Once you get enough thin set on, then you start really spreading it out. I covered up that notch there where we're putting the shelf, but it's already cut, so that's okay. I'm just going to come straight up, make some nice tracks, real nice tracks. Okay, I got a little thin set on the tile down here, so I'm just going to wipe it off. Take my trowel, smooth that out. Okay, so we'll take our first tile, we'll just put it down and get it lined up with that line. Now I just take my spacers and start sticking them in. Now I use these horseshoe spacers because I can do 2 tiles on one corner, but you want to make sure you still line up that grout joint and see that. And if you're going off on your line at all, because one of the tiles is a little off, you just take the wedge and you'll stick a wedge in there to adjust it. Or maybe it needs adjusting down here on the bottom where it's still wet, where you can still do that. Just keep putting your tile on. Now you can see I'm coming up to the top here. And you can see we're pretty darn close to our line there. Now if I'm going to be short on that a little bit, that's going to be okay as long as it's consistent the whole way. But otherwise I'd just build this up with wedges to get that line completely out, which is what I'll probably do.